Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Again, this is Dave Nagel, very excited to continue the dialogue and conversation with my friends in Fremont Unified School District. This next webinar, Webinar 2A, will continue what we looked at just in the previous one, and now taking that matrix that I showed and introduced in the previous webinar and look specifically at some district examples and how other districts have used that to give us some ideas for how we might begin the work in Fremont at the specific grade level and course teams. Hopefully you have your working handout with you, and now we're moving on to part 2A, looking at the district examples for using the prioritizing standard matrix. Again, we're back to the same success criteria as the previous webinar, but focusing more on number 2, hopefully to develop a course of action from seeing these examples for your PLC or collaborative team using the criteria for selecting priority standards of endurance, leverage, readiness. So let's dig in now to 3 specific examples which you have in front of you. So what you see here for the first 2, some language arts examples. Determine the central idea of a text and analyze its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details. Provide an objective summary of the text. That standard can easily be applied to life skills. It will stand the test of time. This particular district that I worked with, they found that was significantly assessed on high stakes tests, which was a smarter balanced state. It was also highly assessed in the park states that I've worked with. Could it be applied to other levels of learning? Absolutely. As we progress through English language arts, that can be applied through reading informational text, reading literature text. Confidence and readiness for the next grade level. The teachers at the 9th, 10th grade level determined it's a pretty important one when students would move towards grades 11 and 12. Current assessment results support emphasis. This particular districts, they didn't have their results back yet. If you are analyzing your smarter balanced results or your next generation science standards when those come back, that will always be a criteria. Can that be applied to other areas? Can we apply determining the central idea of a text, providing an objective summary of a text, out of English into science and social studies? Well, of course. Number of checks, more than 5. Is it a priority standard? Absolutely. Let's look at the next one. Analyze seminal U.S. documents of historical and literacy significance. Washington's Farewell Address, the Gettysburg Address, Roosevelt's 4 Letters of Freedom speech, King's letter from Birmingham jail, including how they addressed related themes and concepts. Certainly, I think they could be applied to life skills, as this particular set of teachers determined. Was it assessed on high-stakes test? Those documents specifically weren't, and analyzing documents like that really wasn't assessed. Certainly could be applied to other levels of learning, looking at documents with literary significance. But confidence from grades 9 and 10 to grades 11 and 12, those specific documents and analyzing U.S. documents of historical and literary significance was not essential to move into grades 11 and 12. Should students be looking at some of those documents? Certainly. It's a conversation, but it's more of a debate if those documents and that piece is really critical compared to when we look at standard 910-2, reading language arts, or reading for informational text. No current information to determine if the assessment results support emphasis. The crossover to other areas, they put an X, but they specifically put a lowercase x. It's not analyzing the U.S. documents. Analyzing documents and reading closely, certainly, there's an anchor standard for that. But this is where we can see, here's a standard that might not meet the criteria for priority. I'm going to look at the 2 more that are left in your handout that I'll walk us through in this document. First, the middle school science example. Analyze and interpret data on properties of substances before and after substances interact to determine if a chemical reaction has occurred. The only place that the team couldn't decide if it was not a factor yet was significantly assessed on high-stakes test. Couldn't determine that yet. And they said, as of right now, no. But it can meet all the other criteria. So right now, they were going to consider that a priority standard. Had more than 4 of the criteria, probably close to 5. Let me look at one other example that you see in your handout, where we have to apply another filter. So here's a middle school next generation science standard. Develop and use a model to describe how the total number of atoms does not change in a chemical reaction and thus mass is conserved. That is not something that's going to carry over into life skills. It is not something that students are going to need to succeed completely in life. I think a lot of us who might be watching this webinar, whether we're not science teachers, whether we are science teachers, we might not be able to do that, but we still might be succeeding just okay. If we can't cite specific, textual evidence, a little bit different story. It actually was assessed on this state's next generation assessment tool that they're using. Could be applied to other levels of learning within science. It is definitely confidence from going from middle school to the next course of study, and certainly when students get into chemistry. Their assessment results don't necessarily yet support emphasis, and there's not much crossover to other content areas, developing that model for atoms. So really, 4 or more for sure equals it to be a priority. This one had 3 maybe, but it was a priority standard, because that's a critical science content standard that students are going to need as they develop through physical science, and certainly move on as they get into high school and even into some aspects of biology, but certainly chemistry. So as we see here, these filters tell us 4 or more, for sure it's likely a priority. But that doesn't mean just because they haven't met all of them. That would be a very science-specific conversation with science teachers around readiness. Readiness is where the science teachers have to come together, or social studies, or English, or math, and say, is that really something that might not have as much crossover, but it's critical for success from one course to the next, because within our science program that we're teaching, we're going to really emphasize that the students can do that, and not just focus on the number of atoms, but that chemical reaction and related to mass, important concept in science. So again, I want us to see that that number of checks is a strong guideline to when for sure to say it's a priority. But when we're seeing high levels of readiness that we agree upon, that's criteria for likely it should be a priority within our content areas that we're expected to teach well, because students are going to need it when they move on to my peers' next course in this example, science. So a chance for a reflection question. How might your PLC, your subject course, or collaborative team begin to select priority standards for units being taught this coming school year, and using the matrix as a tool to determine where some of our standards might meet certain amounts of the criteria, and then the content-specific teams, subject matter teams, can really dig in to that readiness piece. I'll pause for just a moment, pause the recording as long as you need to reflect on the question, and certainly if you're with your peers, to have a dialogue as long as you would need. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. As always, I plan to pause the recording just momentarily so you have a chance to pause it, but I would assume you would be able to take as much time as you need in this recording as to continue your conversation with your peers and colleagues. As always, if you have any questions, please contact me at dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. And as I mentioned before, do not hesitate if you want to go deeper, whether it's through an email dialogue, but if you wanted to follow up with a phone call or even a webinar around any of these pieces, please don't hesitate to do so. Thanks so much for your participation. I look forward to touching base with you soon.